Good evening. It is mighty noisy, but I'm going to try to read to you and finish off this chapter for us. Thank you for being with me. There's a planetary alignment tonight that I'm looking forward to hopefully seeing, so while I'm waiting, I thought I'd finish reading for us. I'm reading us the Warrior Queens. We're on page 68. As the priest class of Celtic society, the Druids were drawn from among the tribal aristocracy. Oh my goodness. That was a mosquito. What the heck? Wow, mosquitoes are out. Oh my goodness. This is going to be a different little trick here. I apologize. As the priest class of Celtic society, the Druids were drawn from among the tribal aristocracy. The Druids of Gaul, in the time of Caesar at least, were believed to constitute an important nationalist focus for their people. Caesar was also convinced 100 years before the Boudiccan revolt that Druidism was an import from Britain to Gaul, with Druids returning to Britain again in order to refresh their knowledge. Even if the Druids were not as politically influential as was supposed by the Romans, it was the belief which was the important point. At any rate, the Druids were suppressed either for their barbarous practices, the official reason given, or for their political activities. Once again, there was no warning. What were these barbarous practices? Barbarous. The normal priestly concerns of the Druids were all those of ritual magic, including, of course, intercession to the gods via animal sacrifice. Gibbon acquitted the Druids of actual human sacrifice, supposing the charge to be a mere excuse for suppressing them on other political grounds, and wrote freely and wrote feelingly of the Celtic religion. The deities of 1,000 groves and 1,000 streams possessed in peace their local and respective influence. But it is generally believed nowadays that the references are too numerous to be ignored. At some point in the past, the Druids must have practiced it, though it may well have died out by the 1st century BC. Human sacrifice was something from which the Romans shrank in fastidious horror, although the unarmed Christians, matched in the arena against wild beasts for the delectation of the emperor and the Roman crowd, might have found such disgust ironical. The notion of human sacrifice, like the notion of nationalist political influence, combined conveniently to the present the image of a body, both hateful and threatening, and thus ripe for suppression. This is not to dismiss Gibbon's equally evocative image of tranquil sylvan deities, which may represent another part of the truth. In the early 19th century, Gerard de Nerval wrote of the history of the death of religions as being even more terrifying than the history of the fall of great empires. All of us must sometimes tremble to find so many dark gates opening out to nothingness. Certainly to contemplate the Druids themselves in the absence of any literature, non-existent because they were not literate, is to gaze through a very dark gate indeed. The classical writers who must under the circumstances remain our only guides, are not necessarily equipped for the task. To discern actual policy is the desperate action of a body whose motives and practices are completely alien, is difficult if not impossible. Returning to the British Druids of Mona, 100 years after the time of Caesar, they were, according to Tacitus, harboring rebels at their sanctuary, thus transforming it into a form of political refuge. Does that mean that Druids of 1st century Britain were also busily fomenting an anti-Roman feeling elsewhere? In short, were the British Druids actually responsible for the planned coincidence, of the East Anglian uprising and Suetonius's absence in remotest Wales? Tempting as such a theory might be, there is no hard evidence for such a conclusion. That might not be relevant if, as we suggested by Sir Cyril Fox, the Druidic hierarchy were busy organizing the gold trade of the Iceni via the seaports of the Wash. Certainly the coastal access of the Iceni, which made their peaceful attitudes interesting to the Romans, is not to be ignored. In the absence of any proof, however, one is thrown back on the palpable injustices which the Iceni had unquestionably endured, as had the Trinovantes to the south. There was quite enough here to whip up a revolt. It therefore seems more plausible to regard the uprising now led by Boudica as a spontaneous explosion for which there were deep-rooted causes, financial and economic, with a particular incitement of the Iceni arising from the treatment of their queen, rather than something planned or fomented by the Druids of Mona. If there was a religious dimension to the Boudican revolt, and it seems from Dio's account of the British behavior that there was, then it sprang from two sources. One was the natural equation of a popular religion and political resistance, which occurs when the religion of the conqueror is markedly different from that of the conquered. Irish history since 1650, the Catholicism of the people versus the Protestantism of the ascendancy, is the classic example of this. Such an equation needed no encouragement from afar. The second source would be Boudica's own self-identification as a religious figure, whether as priestess, prophetess, or even quasi-goddess. Boudica, according to Dio, addressed her tribe at enormous length on the eve of the Rout, R-O-U-T, which would lead them towards Camuldenum or Colchester. The enunciation of such elaborate orations if not the common practice of barbarian warrior queens, we cannot know, was certainly the common practice of classical historians, who were accustomed to put these set pieces into the mouths of their characters on appropriately dire, solemn, or patriotic occasions. Tacitus gives Boudica his version of a speech, both queenly and bellicose, at a later point on the eve of the battle. It's pretty. Dio begins his account with the physical description of Boudica, quoted earlier. Gives her a spear to rattle in her fist. She shew herself the most dreadful, as Holinshed would later have it, and described her clothing, a tunic of diverse colors over which a thick mantle was fastened with a brooch. This, he tells us, was her invariable attire. He then elevates her high on a tribunal, the kind of raised platform used by Roman magistrates and generals. The speech which follows has not fared well at the hands of later historians. Milton, in fine misogynist form, sneered at it in his History of Britain. He ran it together with Tacitus's version and put Boudica somewhat appropriately on a high heap of turveys in a loose-bodied gown. So much for her guilty dress, declaiming fondly, that is, foolishly, a deal by the fondness they, Dio and Tacitus, put into her mouth not worth recital. How she was lashed, how her daughters were handed things worthier silence, retirement, and a veil, than for a woman to repeat as done to her own person, or to hear repeated before a host of men. Sir Ronald Sime, who otherwise found Dio's account verbose and miserable, regarded the speech as a monstrosity. More recently, it has been described as long, not to say exhaustive. Clearly, Boudica did not address her tribe in the terms given to us by a 2nd century Greek, epitomized by an 11th century monk, and here translated into early 20th century English. But the sentiments she made to express do at least serve to remind one, quite vividly, of the recent treatment of the Bretons at the hands of the Romans. Boudica talks about the difference between freedom and slavery, which they have learned from experience. Tacitus at this point merely has the Bretons in general, without mention of Boudica, arguing for freedom over slavery, and touches on their ancestral mode of life, boasting of their hardiness. She points out how the Bretons have suffered since the Romans appeared in Britain. Have we not been robbed entirely of most of our possessions, and those the greatest, while for those that remain we pay taxes? Although the Britons should rightly have repelled the Romans when they first invaded, it is not too late for them to act now, if only for the sake of their children, lest they too be raised up in bondage. It is, however, what Boudica does, rather than what she says, which gives its importance to Dio's account. for having spoken, the queen suddenly releases a hair from the folds of her dress as a species of divination. As the hair fled, it was seen by the multitudes to run in the auspicious direction. There were general shouts of delight at what was clearly a favorable omen for the uprising, as it was clearly intended to be, for one imagines that Boudica, astute enough to install the hair, was also astute enough to ensure that it ran in the right direction. The choice of a hare was also deliberate. This is an animal which features mysteriously and excitingly in the mythology of many countries, from the Far East to the pre-conquest inhabitants of North America, and it had been mentioned already by Caesar as among those animals sacred to the Bretons. Various traces of hares in outline and other depictions of them as hunted beasts have been preserved. These may well have religious significance. Boudica then prayed to a goddess named Andraste or Andeste in one manuscript. I thank thee, Andraste, and call upon thee as woman, speaking to woman. Although this is the only specific mention of the name of Andraste, it may well relate, given the process of translation and epitomization, to that of the goddess of the Vocanti in southeast Gaul, and Darta, and a general British goddess of victory, mentioned by Dio later, and Date. It could also be some compound derived from Anu, one of the names of the Celtic super-goddesses, the mother of all the mothers, as it were. The name is, however, less important than the type, for while the local Celtic deities have hundreds of names, the types remain consistent. Andraste was presumably the war goddess of the Iceni, one goddess portrayed on an Iceni coin, with an individuality and a vigor atypical of classical art, may be intended to depict Andraste. This is not the unique reference to a woman enacting a prophetic role in this period. Tacitus commented that the German tribe traditionally regarded many of the female sex as prophetic, and indeed by excess of superstition as divine. About 10 years after the Boudican uprising, an unmarried woman designated as Velida, the word in Celtic implies the functions of a prophetess, was described by him as enjoying wide influence over some Rhinelanders called the Bructeri. A captured legionary legate Minuus Lupercus was dispatched to her as a gift. Although put to death before she could bend him to her purposes, whatever they might have been, Velida's prestige was further enhanced when she foretold the massacre of the Roman army at Vetera. Later, Velida was used as an intermediary by the citizens of Cologne. Personal approaches to Velida of any sort were not permitted. Her relatives, with the idea of increasing the aura of veneration about her, kept her immured in a high tower, one of their number transmitting questions and answers, as if he were mediating between a god and his worshippers. Nor did the Romans attempt to dispute her sacred credentials. It seems that when they finally captured Velida, she was installed in the service of a temple at Ardea. Similarly, Boudica, whose eventual fate was to be very different, in releasing her hair and issuing her supplication, not only associated herself with the goddess, but assumed a composite role of priestess, prophetess, and war leader, holy, armed figurehead, in accordance with Celtic tradition and myth. So, Boudica, queen and leader of the Iceni, swept down upon hapless Camalodunum Colchester in her chariot. She had assembled an initial host of 120,000, according to Dio. It was the apparent suddenness of the attack upon a defenseless city which made it so horrifying in its consequences. But of course, the fact of the British assault should not have come upon the Roman inhabitants so suddenly, just as Colchester itself should not have been so defenseless. The suddenness was not so much in the British attack itself as in the minds of the Romans who faced it. The Roman veterans, happily enjoying their generous grants of land, including those tracts to which they had helped themselves, must have ignored other signs, which should have been more telling to them than the blood-red sea and the outlandish cries in the theater. Tacitus mentions the 5th column within the city, who made sure that it was not defended properly. But this 5th column, occulti rebellionis conscientiae, literally, secret conspirators in the rebellion, must have consisted of native Trinovantes, whose loyalties, given that they were first dispossessed, then ill-treated, should never have been taken for granted. To explain the Roman negligence, Donald R. Dudley and Graham Webster, authors of the study The Rebellion of Boudica, called attention to that overconfidence that often besets colonial powers. Writing in 1962, they pointed out that the British had shown an equal negligent attitude toward the Mau Mau tribal insurrection in its first stages, for which oversight an official report had recently criticized the government of Kenya. The comparison is certainly a valid one, not only for the tribal, nationalist character of both uprisings. The Roman settlers of Camalodunum Colchester, confronted by a series of atrocities, apparently totally unheralded, must have experienced something like the same appalled bewilderment as the British settlers of Kenya some 1900 years later. The plain fact was that the Romans simply could not conceive that the Britons could do this to them. Rise up, sack a city, and massacre its inhabitants? History, after all, provides plenty of examples of this kind of tragic error. It is a common mistake on the part of the conquering power to consider a rebellion of the conquered to be impossible. The because they find it unbelievable. The Romans of Camulodunum, Colchester, merely joined in this error, and they suffered for it. Nor was disbelief confined to Camulodunum, Colchester itself. Once the situation was accepted within the colonia for what it was, serious, but not yet desperate, there was still time for the veteran settlers to send for reinforcements from London to the few men still under arms at Camulodunum, Colchester. Here, however, the procurators Catus Decianus, showing himself to be complacent as well as rapacious, thought it sufficient to dispatch a mere 200 men who would perish with their former comrades. Around the wall-less town itself, not even a rampart or a palisade was erected, for which there must have been time if reinforcements could still be summoned from afar. Most tragic of all, the women, the children, and the old people were not sent away. The town was overrun without difficulty. Archaeological evidence not only confirms that there were no walls, as Tacitus stated, but that the original defenses erected by the legionaries had actually been leveled down. Over them were built a series of houses made of wattle and stake, and filled in and covered with daub. These, for one last desperate effort to survive until reinforcements came, weapons and armor, rusty with disuse, have been discovered, which the veterans must have hastily routed and donned. The picture of these old war horses, once the masters of Europe, now destined to die, antiquated weapons to hand, at the hands of the despised barbarians outside the limits of the known world, as they had once complained to Claudius, has its own poignancy, for unlike Lucknow and Mafeking, there was to be no relief for this particular garrison. The gaudy temple was battered down and fired. The veterans, like their families, put to the sword. The Britons under Boudicca surveyed the smoking town and turned their faces toward London. For the Romans, when news of the Holocaust reached them, there was an additional humiliation to be faced. Moreover, wrote Dio Cassius, all this ruin was brought upon them by a woman, a fact which in itself caused them the greatest shame. And we finished that chapter. Here's what I've been reading to you. And the next one will be chapter 6. I am looking forward to it. Seems like we got to this book just in time now, didn't we? I appreciate you. To get a chance, run outside and try to spot some planets.